Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Tabuns. I'm the Ontario NDP critic for climate and environment. I'm going to start by introducing my fellow panelists this morning. Dr. James Hansen is a renowned climatologist and was formerly head of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Kristen Caspar, Litigation Counsel for Greenpeace's Climate Justice and Liability Project, and Keith Stewart, Senior Energy Strategist for Greenpeace Canada. This afternoon, I'll be introducing my bill, Liability for Climate-Related Harms Act 2018. This bill will provide a legal framework for governments and individuals to seek compensation for climate-related damage and compensation for infrastructure needed to protect against climate-related damage. Ontario has taken a number of steps on climate action, but increasingly the cost of climate damage will be a burden on our society and on individuals. This act will give Ontarians the legal means to seek compensation from the world's major polluters for their fair share of those costs. In this, it follows the path of Ontario's tobacco liability legislation, brought forward to recover compensation for health-related costs from tobacco use. The world's largest fossil fuel corporations have to start paying their fair share of the damages that are going to be inflicted by climate change, and they also have to pay for the steps necessary to protect people from those climate damages. No one has calculated the cost of climate change damage to Ontario to date. Storm damage in Ontario in 2013 alone exceeded $1 billion between the summer flash flooding in the GTA and the ice storm in December. The cost to protect us in the future is as yet undetermined. To give a sense of scale, New York City, in its climate lawsuit, noted that it will be spending $20 billion to protect that city from future climate damage and is seeking commensurate compensation. I want to thank West Coast Environmental Law and Greenpeace for their assistance in developing this bill. I'll turn now to Dr. Hansen, who can talk about the scale of risk we're facing as a society and why we need to take this big step to hold fossil fuel companies responsible for their fair share of the cost of climate change. Dr. Hansen.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this important climate liability bill. Climate change is already underway, but because of the inertia of the climate system, delayed response, it's today's young people and their children who are most threatened. If unchecked, climate change threatens young people with irreversible effects, including sea level rise and extermination of species, potentially a more desolate world. It's not too late to minimize climate change, but precatory government agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, are basically wishful thinking. Actual phase down of carbon emissions and justice for young people will only occur when fossil fuel companies must pay for costs of climate change. So they have the incentive to become clean energy companies. Canada has an opportunity to be an example, to lead the world in the right direction. And I congratulate Peter for bringing this bill forward, and I wish you success. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Ms. Casper.
My name is Kristen Caspar, and I'm Litigation Counsel for Greenpeace's Global Climate Justice and Liability Campaign. I'd like to begin by thanking Peter Tabuns for bringing this private member's bill forward and urge all parties to vote in favor. I'm here to provide some insight on the international context for holding fossil fuel producers accountable for climate impacts. I work with lawyers and communities around the world who are seeking justice for climate impacts like stronger storms, sea level rise, and they're already being felt and are only going to get worse. There is a wave of climate lawsuits sweeping the world, and today there's an opportunity for Ontario to take the lead in proactively addressing the inevitable and massive costs of climate change. New York, San Francisco, and 7 other communities are already suing oil companies, seeking compensation for the cost of protecting residents and economies from the devastating impacts. A Peruvian farmer and mountain guide is asking a German court to force a coal-producing and burning utility to pay its share of the cost of protecting his hometown from a swollen glacier at risk of overflowing from melting snow and ice, resulting in damage to his property. Communities in the Philippines have successfully petitioned their Human Rights Commission to investigate the role of fossil fuel companies, including 4 Canadian companies, in possible human rights abuses arising from climate impacts like supercharged typhoons. Here in Canada, thanks to the efforts by West Coast Environmental Law, 6 BC communities, including the city of Victoria, are sending letters to 20 of the world's largest fossil fuel companies, asking that they pay their fair share of the local costs of climate change. I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have regarding these cases, but let me end by saying that we need this type of legislation to make it easier for people who are being harmed from climate change to hold big polluters accountable so that they pay their fair share of protecting our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
My name is Keith Stewart. I'm Senior Energy Strategist with Greenpeace Canada. Any politician who says they're standing up for the little guy should support this legislation because it clears a path for fossil fuel companies to pay their fair share towards protecting our communities from the ravages of climate change. This bill is modeled on the legislation that enabled the province to pursue $50 billion in healthcare costs from the tobacco industry. And that legislation was enacted because the tobacco companies knew about the addictiveness of cigarettes and the health damages they caused. They deceived the public by misrepresenting the risks. They failed to warn the public about the dangers of smoking, and they did not take all available steps to reduce the risks caused by their products. All of these things are true with respect to fossil fuel companies and climate change. Why is this coming forward now? The wave of climate litigation that is sweeping the world is being driven by 3 developments. First, scientists have gotten better at establishing a causal link between the burning of fossil fuels and impacts like sea level rise or the severity of individual events like the Houston floods. Secondly, we now have much better data on the contributions of individual fossil fuel companies to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The most recent research found that the emissions linked to the world's 90 largest carbon producers, a mix of investor and state-owned fossil fuel companies and cement producers, have contributed 50% to the rise in global average temperature and 30% to the rise in sea level since 1880. And thirdly, investigative journalism has exposed how companies like ExxonMobil claimed for years that climate science was too uncertain to warrant government action, and they even financed enormous multi-million-dollar disinformation campaigns to manufacture doubt about climate science. Yet at the same time, those companies were privately incorporating the science they were publicly dismissing into business plans to protect their drilling operations against a warming Arctic and rising seas. Just like tobacco, oil and coal companies hid what they knew about the science in order to delay policy action that would reduce the market for their product. And just like tobacco, they should have to pay their fair share of fixing the problem that they not only played a major role in creating, but also made worse by delaying the actions required to solve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Any idea of what the litigation costs would be for something like this? Assuming that your bill passes and that the government then decides they want to take that step, I mean, court is expensive to fight that out.
Yeah, there's no question. To be honest, Keith, we haven't done an analysis, Andrew, what it would cost to pursue the legal action itself. But I think it would be dwarfed by the cost to Ontario of climate damage. Climate damage is going to cost us in the many billions of dollars. So if a court case costs us several million, the cost benefit is very clear. We are going to have a huge burden put on us dealing with damage and infrastructure costs that will far exceed any legal cost.
And it seems like it's a fairly substantial burden of proof that you would need to show. How would you imagine that the government of Ontario in future could lead that kind of legal challenge to say you knew and you should pay for this?
Well, the way the bill is structured, it assumes strict liability on the part of producers so that first of all, they aren't going to be able to make an argument, we didn't know. No, you made a product, and it is generally known that your product causes damage. Setting aside the very extensive work that's been done by New York City in their lawsuit, showing that the fossil fuel majors knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what the consequences would be. But again, this bill defines the nature of evidence to be produced, and it simplifies this whole action. There is an assumption in this bill that climate change is caused by man-made action, the emission of CO2 into the atmosphere, and it sets a threshold for determining whether a particular event has caused damage. If it's more than twice if it occurs more than twice the frequency that one would normally see, that's the threshold that has been established internationally. It will simplify this, just as the tobacco liability legislation simplified all the actions on those parts.
Is litigation the next logical frontier for the climate fight?
I'll turn that to Ms. Casper.
It's quickly becoming that. The courts are playing a very powerful role in adjudicating climate change, both looking at compensation for harm that is happening and occurring now and also future harm, but also in the prevention of harm. So litigation is, I think, inevitable. And this legislation makes it easier for individuals, cities, communities to bring forward that litigation because we only have a small window of opportunity to act.
You mentioned that this was the next wave, or you're seeing this new wave of cities and communities that are resorting to the courts to try and make these challenges. What opportunities do you think the courts could provide for people or cities to have their voices heard?
Well, one is getting the evidence on record, what we're seeing a lot in the United States with the cases, and also what's going to be happening starting tonight, our time, and tomorrow is people who believe that fossil fuel companies are creating harm and danger to their lives, of getting on record the evidence that is happening. So there's an important storytelling component. But most importantly, the cases about compensation are about money and protecting communities. And as Mr. Tabuns has pointed out, the damage is going to be in the millions, if not billions. And so these cases are important in shifting the costs from taxpayers to the companies that are most responsible.
Mr. Stewart, you had mentioned that basically anyone who's going to stand up in the hustings and say that they are in support of the little guy should be in favor of this legislation. Can you explain what you mean by that a little bit more?
Sure. Right now, the costs for cleaning up the mess and putting in the new infrastructure to prevent worse damages, things like stronger sewer systems, trying to keep Toronto Island from being flooded, for example, those are borne by government and homeowners. Increasingly, people are going to find that they aren't going to be able to get insurance for their home against flooding risk. Right now, that's your tough luck. What this bill does is it makes it easier to make sure that the companies who have played a significant role in causing this, but also lied about it for decades to fight the actions that would have prevented some of this harm, pay their fair share. And I think any politician who says, I'm standing up for the little guy, I'm looking out for you, should be looking out for them when it comes to climate damages as well, and making sure that the big guys who cause this problem pay their fair share. And I think that's what this bill helps do. So it's, there's a big debate on carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is an important part of the solution, but this is also going to be an important part of adapting to this new world that we have created.
Other questions? There are none. I want to thank Dr. Hansen, Kristen Casper, Keith Stewart for joining me this morning, and I look forward to talking to people about the issue in the days to come. Thanks very much.